Welcome back to all of our 95 Network members. My name is Austin Savage, and I am back with our Executive Director, Dale Sellers. And today we are talking about an always relevant topic, the topic of change, and specifically how to create an atmosphere for organizational change. And man, for pastors, especially pastors in small churches, this is just such an important topic. Just yesterday, I was watching a live webinar Q&A with Carey Nieuwhof, and one pastor just put in the comments there, he said, I lead in a church that is mostly older people, and we moved the communion table just 10 feet to the left, and ever since then, I've not stopped hearing about it. Like, what do I do? And so I think for a lot of pastors, they want to implement change, but they're just worried about what will happen when they do. And then there's other pastors who just don't think it's worth it. And so I think that this is just a really important topic. And Dale, I know that you've had an experience recently where a church did implement healthy change. So if you want to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I work with a church in the north that for many years has been wanting to change the name of the church. I won't say the name just because of our friendship, but they needed to change their name. The name that they had was very old and dated sounding, and I think it took about 10 years to make that change, to change the name of the church. And the cool thing was I got a text on Sunday night from the pastor letting me know that as of this past Sunday, it was their first day with their new name. And I just thought how sad it was that it took 10 years
That long.
to change the name of the church. And the story you told, I spent the first 10 years, my wife and I, on the road with Christian music groups. So we would come into churches and we would have to move furniture from time to time to set up to do our concerts. And you would not believe some of the things. We could spend the whole broadcast talking about the stories of things that happened there. My favorite is when one lady walked up and looked at our speaker stack while we were setting up. And we had very small speakers, so it wasn't like we were intimidating. And she looked at our speaker stack and she pointed to me and she said, "That's too loud." And I said, "Ma'am, it's not even plugged in yet. We haven't even turned it on." She said, "Well, it looks loud." I'll never forget that as long as I live, because I was there plugging the speakers into the amps and actually had someone tell me it was too loud when it wasn't even so.
That is crazy.
Yeah, it's just the stuff that our pastors deal with, and I think what that does, and this is kind of leads into what we want to talk about, is there's this tension about change. And you said it earlier. You know, some guys they want to navigate the change, and some guys just go, "It's not worth the effort to change." But the thing is, we're in a place. I think we're in a place in the church today that I don't think we've ever been in, at least not to this degree in America ever, where we have thousands of churches a year that are closing. They're dying. They're shutting down. And it's not because they don't have facilities. Some of them have great facilities. It's all paid for. They have lots of land. They have, but they are unwilling to change. And one of the elements that involve that is the fact that that we have so many generations alive at the same time.
Right.
We had a friend who wrote a book called Generational IQ, and he talked about in that book that this is the first time ever we've had 5 generations alive at the same time. And in every church, the older generation tends to want to hold on to power. And so there's such a generation gap that is creating this tension where pastors just don't know what to do. So I thought it would be good today to talk about how to create an atmosphere so we can create organizational change, and some ideas, some things that I know are proven that work, and some things that may help you. And I think a couple things maybe to help you not do. So, you know, if you want to dive into that, I think that'd be just a great thing to help these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you came up with 5 of those. So let's go ahead and start going through that list.
Okay. The first one is simply this: you got to do your homework first.
Yep.
You know, you've got to develop a thorough understanding of what needs to change. Because if you just change for just the sake of change, it'll bring a disaster. It'll fall apart in your face. You've got to recognize where's the organization going, what needs to be added, what needs to be subtracted, what have you been doing well, what have you not been doing well. But you can't just decide, I'll tell you what I think we'll do. We'll just go ahead and add a bunch of new initiatives because we know we're stuck. I worked for a pastor many years ago who in 3 years, I never will forget this. I was one of the staff members. In 3 years, he announced 28 different initiatives that the Lord told him, if you'll do these initiatives, then the church is going to grow. 3 years, 28 initiatives, and obviously he was just trying to find what can we do to make it work and how to make it grow. But you've got to clearly define your vision. You've got to clearly define what you want where you want to take the organization to. Remember, change is not like putting a Band-Aid on something. Change is like surgery. And so you've got to understand, you got to do your homework, because if you don't, I promise you it'll blow up in your face. Which leads us kind of the second thing. The second thing that I really want churches and pastors to focus on is you've got to assess your leadership team and make sure they truly are with you. This week's one of my favorite weeks of the year because it's the beginning of college football. And I happen to be a big Clemson Tiger football fan. And our coach, Dabo Swinney, is one of his great statements that is attributed to him is that everybody needs to be all in. Yeah. And when you're going to make change with your church, whether it's you have a staff, whether it's a trustee or a deacon board, whether it's volunteer leaders, however your church is set up, if you're going to make the change that you need to make, you've got to make sure that everybody is on the same page, that they're all bought in, because here's what's going to happen. You're going to have conflict, and you're going to have situations that happen that are going to reveal, are there underlying agendas? Are there people who say they're with you, but they're really not with you? And you've got to understand that it doesn't take a majority to make great change, but it does take great leadership. In fact, if you study the scriptures, there's never been a time in scripture where God needed a majority to do anything. I love the story of Gideon, and he just kept, paring it down and paring it down and paring it down. And he went for many thousands to a few hundred people to bring about the change that he was supposed to bring about. So, but it's very important that you have a lot of heart-to-heart meetings. And one of the things I learned a long time ago is that when you're leading a team, it's really important when you have either trustees or outside board members that you meet with those guys individually once a month. And I'm not talking about politicking or manipulating. I'm just saying you've got to stay in relationship with those people around you if you're going to be effective at bringing about the change.
Yeah, Dale, let's talk a little bit more about that one too, because obviously it's really important to make sure that your leadership team is bought in with whatever initiative you're trying to do. And you mentioned meeting together with them, but what is the best way to kind of clarify if people are bought in, and kind of how do you reveal if somebody does have any of those underlying agendas or different?
We'll talk a little more in the next couple of points about this overall thought, but you have to release change in increments.
Yep.
You can't just overwhelm people with what needs to happen. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier. We usually try to come up with these gimmicks or what's hot now, and we want to embrace it. I was just talking with a friend last night who's he's in my family. He's been part of a church that has been really basically they pride themselves on being about 40 years behind. And they're you'll love this one. Their big thing they're about to unveil this fall is they're going to put 2 screens up in the auditorium so that someday they can show videos on them.
Someday.
Because they still use slide projectors.
Right.
So like if missionaries come in, they use slide projectors. But the new pastor is in there. He's bringing about some changes, but even there, he has to move slowly. And I know that, what are you, 22 years old, 24? Yeah. And I know you've got to be kidding me. I promise you, I had that conversation last night.
That's crazy. I don't think I've seen a slide projector since elementary school.
Yeah, well, this particular church, that when they have missionaries come in, that's what they still use.
Wow.
So you've got to understand that you've got to have that core group of people, because look, when the arrows start flying, you want to make sure that people have got your back, and they're not shooting you in the back.
Right.
And so you have to stay, you've got to constantly stay in touch with
Yeah. So those first 2 points, do your homework first. So developing just a thorough understanding of what actually needs to be changed. And then next, assessing if your leadership team is actually bought in with that idea, making sure that they're all in, that they don't have any differing opinions, perspectives. What's next there, Dale?
I have a friend who works with the Unstuck group. He's one of the consultants. His name is Paul Alexander. And I want to give him credit for this quote because I love this. He says, you've got to starve the past. I love that quote because you and again, it kind of piggybacks to what we were just saying. You can't abruptly initiate anything. If you're going to have lasting change happens slowly. The organization has got to develop buy-in for the change to last, because you don't want a big flare up and then a burnout. That's
right.
Pretty good. I like that. Because it doesn't do any good. No matter how bright the fire burns or how hot it gets, if it's just going to burn up and blow out. So you've got to communicate with passion on a consistent level about where you're going instead of just where you've been. This is one of the big things that really hold churches back, is they spend so much time talking about what they've done that they don't really accomplish a lot of where they're going, because they don't know where they're going. Right. And I always use this analogy when I'm talking about this. You're driving your car. If you're driving down the road and you're looking in the rear view mirror, you're either going to end up in a ditch or you're going to hit a tree. You can't go forward looking back. Yep. But to Paul's point that he made, you have to starve the past. You can't just cut off the past.
Right.
You just quit feeding it. And, and you quit highlighting it, and you don't spend time in your services always talking about the good old days or what happened way back there. And I also want to balance this too, because I believe every church that exists today is built on the shoulders of many saints who've gone before us. And I never want to dishonor them. I never want to put them down. I never want to speak about them in a negative light. We're standing on their shoulders. But you cannot go forward continuing to try. Well, even with the church I mentioned earlier, who just now is embracing putting video screens up. You can't go forward if you're always looking back, or you'll never accomplish anything.
Right. I think even the church you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that changed their name, the reason that they had to change it is because their old name was based on something that had happened in the past.
Absolutely.
So they had to make a huge shift in now casting vision for who they want to be moving forward. So that's so important. They
actually named it after, in a sense, they named it because of a former pastor who had passed away. And I'll tell you, I went to another church in North Carolina one time when we were on the road, and the name of the church, it was named after the former pastor's wife. Wow. And because I don't want to highlight that church, I won't say her name, but it was not a normal name. So if I was referring to you and it was Austin, it was Austin Baptist Church, and it didn't make any sense. Why do they call the church Austin Baptist Church? Well, it's because they're stuck back there where things happened in the past, and this is a common thing that happens in churches.
Yeah. So back to what we said there, you have to starve the past. So it's not an instant thing that'll happen. It's something that has to be slowly introduced. To start moving that perspective from where you've been, what you've done, to where you're headed and what you will do.
I always like to talk about the Titanic, because the Titanic could have missed the iceberg if they had just turned. But you can't decide in the last minute to turn. It's got to be a plan. That thing was hard, and that's the way your church is. I don't care if your church is 80 people or 800 people. It's still to bring about lasting change. Specifically, if you're going to go in another direction, you've got to turn that thing slowly.
Love that image too. Awesome. And the next one just has to do with kind of celebrating the small wins. So what does that one look like?
I heard what I call this point is to embrace and celebrate any positive momentum. If you get any positive momentum, if you get anybody that's excited about what you're doing, and I learned this from John Maxwell a long time ago, that momentum's your best friend. And when you have momentum, you look better than you really are. And when you don't have momentum, you look worse than you really are.
Yeah.
And momentum is not something that's scientific. You can't define it. And again, being a football fan, and it's being that time of year, everybody knows how there's a shift in games when momentum it's like, you can watch one game and the first three quarters, one team's just destroying the other team. And then it's just like they lost all of their pizzazz, and the other team comes back and sometimes wins the game. And oftentimes you'll hear them talk about, man, what a change in momentum. And so if you want to bring about change in any organization, but specifically a small church, I think it's very helpful for you to start celebrating your small victories, in any kind of wins. And look, don't forget to embrace your young people in this arena, because they love to see the change. And And they're all, one of the things that are, the millennial generation gets criticized for everything in America today. And I think it's so unfair. In fact, a lot of churches that I work with, when they start putting down the millennials, I'll look at those people and say, well, those are your children you're talking about. So they learned it somewhere, But
Yeah.
but one of the most, a lot of millennials, a lot of the next generations, they love their church. They don't want their church to die. They
Right.
want their church to be successful. So they are always the first ones who get excited about change.
Yeah.
And so when you start seeing their excitement, highlight them, talk about them. When you're preaching a sermon or you're making announcements or whatever it is you do, say, I was just talking to Austin the other day, and he was just saying how excited he was. Highlight that, because momentum and excitement is contagious.
Right.
Well, and actually, the lack of momentum and boredom is also contagious.
Right. Yeah.
So take advantage of the positive.
That's so true. And I think especially there's going to be a lot of people in your congregation that are slow adopters for whatever initiative it is. And so the more that you can cast vision of those people who are excited, who can kind of share stories of a difference this will make, or a difference it already has made in their lives and in the community's lives. That's just a huge momentum builder moving forward.
Yeah, and I think it leads us to the last one that I think is absolutely, you just got to embrace this. You got to understand this. You've got to, number 5 is you got to understand the consequences of not changing.
Yeah.
And I thought, what can I do to give a really good illustration? I know you like my illustration, so I've got a great one for you. I have a 1-year-old granddaughter, and she's still in diapers. Yeah. And sometimes she needs her diaper changed, that we have the number 1 issue and we have the number 2 issue.
Right.
And when she has the number 2 issue, if you don't change her, she's going to get upset.
Yeah.
And if you're just totally uninterested parent or not focusing, she could actually develop a rash and even get sick from, if you don't take care of her and keep her clean. And there's just a lot of churches that have people, how can you say it? That their churches have people in them who need their diaper changed.
Yeah.
The vision needs to be changed. And so, and I know that's kind of a weird analogy, but I know a lot of folks understand what I'm saying. There's 3 things about what happens if you don't change. You'll have disengagement. Then after you have disengagement, you're going to create disease. And then eventually you'll have death. And again, none of that happens quickly, but over time, if your people are not, you've been doing the same thing for 30 years, people are not engaged. They're just coming, they're going through the motions. They're not learning. They're not growing. There's no spiritual formation. Talked to a wonderful pastor yesterday who told me that in the last several years, this church has baptized 38 to 50 people each year. Wow. And I told him, I said, you need to understand that there's a lot of churches who haven't baptized 38 people in 10 years.
Yeah.
And that's sad. I worked at a church once that when I went on staff, I knew they had a baptistry. And I actually went and cleaned it out, and it had dead mice in it, and it had sawdust in it, and it had dust because they hadn't used it in 8 years. And the thing that bothered me is that no one noticed.
Right.
It was not on anybody's mind that we haven't baptized a person in this church in over 8 years. Wow. And that's what happens. You don't get to that point till your folks are disengaged, to where they're just they're just going through the motions. They're showing up because it's Sunday morning. And I will say this too, Austin. I think that we're moving into an era in American life where they're just not going to come. They're just not going to show up anymore. People are not going to just keep coming to church to go through the motions because they're so busy.
Right.
So hopefully maybe some of those things, that will help folks understand kind of how to bring about some, create an atmosphere for change, for organizational clarity and change. Do your homework first. And then after you've done your homework, assess your leadership team, make sure they're truly bought in. Then you got to starve the past. And that's okay to do. And then embrace and celebrate your momentum. And then the final thing is understand the consequences of what happens if you don't change. If you don't change, you're not going to be around for long. It's just the facts.